Welcome to Cafe Tales. Miss Marple and the Body Among the Roses. Tonight's story begins. But before we dive in, welcome, dear listeners. I'm your host, Ailey, and it's such a joy to share these mysteries with you. Isn't it wonderful how stories can bring us together in such a cozy way? Tell me in the comments, what's your favorite flower? Roses, tulips, orchids, or perhaps another blossom close to your heart? I always enjoy reading your answers, and don't forget to subscribe to Cafe Tales for new mysteries every single day. Now, let's begin our journey into tonight's tale. Chapter 1. Roses, Ribbon, and a Man in the Cold Room. The morning of Saturday, the 8th of May, dawned crisp and bright over the village of Much Benham, with that particular quality of spring light that seemed to polish every surface it touched. The high street bustled with its usual weekend commerce, housewives hurrying with their baskets, children dawdling on their way to the sweet shop, and the general air of purposeful activity that marked a proper English village on market day. At Disa, the corner where the high street curved toward the church, the glass frontage of Pritchard and Posey caught the morning sun like a beacon. Behind the gleaming windows, buckets of flowers stood in neat military rows, their blooms fresh from the dawn market in the larger town some 12 miles distant. The shop's reputation extended well beyond Much Benham's borders, and on this particular morning, it hummed with the peculiar energy that precedes a significant social event. Mrs. Ivy Pritchard moved behind the counter with the efficient grace of a woman who had learned to manage both a business and her emotions with equal skill. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, with prematurely gray hair swept back into a practical chignon and capable hands that seemed to coax beauty from the most recalcitrant stems. The black armband she'd worn for her late husband had long since been put away, but there remained about her a certain dignified restraint that spoke of loss weathered with courage. "Nell," she called to the young woman arranging white roses near the window, "do you mind how you handle those stems? Lady Bantry specifically requested that we avoid any bruising on the petals for this afternoon's arrangement." Nell Pritchard looked up from her work, her gentle face brightening at her aunt's voice. She was a quiet girl of perhaps 22, with mousy brown hair and the kind of unassuming prettiness that revealed itself slowly, like a flower opening in sunlight. Her fingers, however, possessed an almost supernatural delicacy with ribbon and wire, creating bows and arrangements that seemed to capture something beyond mere decoration. "Yes, Aunt Ivy," she replied, adjusting the angle of a particularly fine bloom. "I do think these will be perfect for the Founder's Ball arrangements. Such lovely heads and not a blemish on them." The mention of the Founder's Ball sent a small frisson of excitement through the shop. It was to be the social event of the season, marking the 100th anniversary of the Much Benham Horticultural Society, and every detail had been planned with military precision. The flowers alone represented weeks of careful preparation, from the grand table arrangements to the smaller posies that would grace each lady's place setting. The bell above the door chimed with particular authority as Felix Hartley entered, bringing with him the unmistakable air of a man accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands. He was perhaps 50, with a kind of solid good looks that suggested Rugby in his youth, and comfortable living in his maturity. His estate agency occupied the most prominent position on the high street, and his role as chairman of the Horticultural Society had been assumed as naturally as breathing. "Good morning, Mrs. Pritchard," he declared, his voice carrying that hearty tone that some men adopt when they wish to appear both friendly and authoritative. "I trust everything is proceeding according to plan for this evening's festivities." Ivy's hands paused for just a moment in their work before resuming their steady rhythm. "Indeed, Mr. Hartley, we have everything well in hand. The arrangements will be delivered promptly at 4 yaos, as discussed. Felix nodded approvingly, his gaze sweeping over the shop with a proprietary air of a man surveying his domain. Splendid, splendid. Though I must say, I do hope we can rely on absolute perfection. This evening represents so much more than a simple social gathering. The reputation of our entire community rests upon the success of tonight's celebration. That moment, the rear door that led to the alley opened, admitting a blast of cooler air and the cheerful whistle of Stan Baxter, the delivery boy. Stan was 18, with a kind of earnest, open face that inspired immediate trust and the slightly awkward grace of youth not quite grown into its own strength. His bicycle leaned against the alley wall, its front basket already loaded with the morning's first deliveries. "Morning, Mrs. Pritchard, Mr. Hartley," he called, touching his cap in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and entirely natural. His eyes sought Nell's immediately, and the smile that passed between them held all the sweet promise of young love barely contained. "Ah, Stanley," Felix said, his tone assuming the patronizing note he reserved for those he considered his social inferiors. "I trust you understand the critical importance of today's deliveries. There must be no mistakes, no delays, no dash. "Stan knows his business, Mr. Hartley," Ivy interrupted quietly, but with a firmness that brooked no argument. "He's never failed us yet." The atmosphere in the shop grew perceptibly cooler, though the morning sun continued to stream through the windows with unabated cheerfulness. Felix's smile remained fixed, but something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation that seemed to weigh and measure before filing information away for future use. Of course, he said smoothly. "I merely meant to emphasize the significance of the occasion. After all, we must all do our part to ensure that Much Benham continues to thrive and prosper. Some of us, I'm afraid, have not always been as cooperative as one might hope in matters of community development." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that seemed to settle over the shop like a fine layer of dust. Ivy's face remained carefully composed, but her knuckles whitened slightly as she gripped the stem she was trimming. "Perhaps," Felix continued, his tone conversational but his eyes alert, "we might have a brief word about that matter we discussed last week, Mrs. Pritchard, the one regarding the future of this charming establishment." Before Ivy could respond, the shop bell chimed again, this time admitting a vision of impeccable elegance that seemed to float rather than walk. Ursula Hartley was one of those women who managed to appear both delicate and formidable. Her pale, blonde hair was arranged in perfect waves. Her morning ensemble was coordinated down to the last button. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that perfection was not merely desirable, but absolutely essential. "Felix, darling," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that suggested expensive education and careful cultivation. "I do hope you haven't forgotten about the roses for our dining table this evening. I specifically requested 12 long-stemmed red roses, and they simply must be perfect. The Weatherbees are coming, and you know how critical Margaret can be about flower arrangements." "Of course, my dear," Felix replied, his manner toward his wife markedly different from his treatment of the shop's staff. "Mrs. Pritchard was just about to show us her finest selection, weren't you, Mrs. Pritchard?" Ivy nodded, moving toward the cold room at the rear of the shop, where the most precious blooms were kept in optimal conditions. The cold room was her pride, a glass-fronted chamber that hummed quietly behind the counter, maintaining the perfect temperature and humidity for the delicate flowers that were her specialty. "If you would care to step this way," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I believe you'll find exactly what Mrs. Hartley requires." The cold room door, thick and well sealed, opened with a soft whisper of escaping cool air. Inside, Buckets of roses stood in precise rows, their heads perfect globes of color ranging from the deepest crimson to the palest blush. The air within was sweet with the concentrated perfume of hundreds of blooms, a scent so intense it was almost overwhelming. Felix stepped inside, his practiced eye surveying the available options with the air of a connoisseur. "Yes," he murmured, moving deeper into the small space. "These will do very well indeed. Very well indeed." Ivy stepped back to allow him room to examine the flowers more closely, pulling the heavy door nearly closed behind her to maintain the temperature. The safety latch, she noted automatically, was in its proper position, a simple mechanism that would prevent anyone from being accidentally trapped inside. It was then that the morning took its first decisive turn toward tragedy, though none of those present could have anticipated the chain of events that would follow. The shop bell chimed, once more, admitting Miss Jane Marple, who had come to collect the small posy she had ordered for her goddaughter's confirmation. Behind her came Lady Bantry, resplendent in purple and determined to finalize the arrangements for the evening's floral decorations. The bustle of activity that followed, Nell attending to Miss Marple's modest requirements, Ivy consulting with Lady Bantry about the placement of the larger arrangements, Stan loading his bicycle for the morning's deliveries, created exactly the kind of controlled chaos that characterized a successful flower shop on a busy day. It was nearly an hour later when Stan, returning from his first round of deliveries, approached the cold room to collect the next batch of arrangements. His hand was already reaching for the door handle when he paused, a frown creasing his honest features. "That's odd," he murmured, then called out more loudly. "Mrs. Pritchard, ma'am. The cold room door seems to be latched from the inside." Ivy looked up from the arrangement she was creating, her face suddenly pale. "Latched? But that's impossible. Mr. Hartley went in to select roses for his wife nearly an hour ago." The shop fell silent, except for the quiet humming of the cold room's motor. Miss Marple, who had been examining a particularly fine spray of lilac, turned her attention to the small drama unfolding before her, her faded blue eyes alert and interested. Stan tried the door again, pressing his shoulder against it experimentally. "It's definitely latched. Won't budge at all." Ivy moved quickly to the cold room, her face now ashen with concern. She knocked sharply on the glass panel, calling, "Mr. Hartley, Mr. Hartley, are you quite all right in there?" No response came from within. Through the glass, they could see the familiar rows of flower buckets, but no sign of movement. "Stan," Ivy said, her voice tight with worry. "Fetch the spare key from the office drawer. Quickly now." But even as Stan hurried to comply, Miss Marple's experienced eye was taking in details that would prove significant in the hours to come. The way the door seemed to fit just slightly differently in its frame, the faint scent that seemed to hang in the air near the cold room entrance, the particular quality of silence that emanated from within the glass-fronted chamber. When Stan finally managed to release the latch and swing the door wide, the sight that greeted them would remain, etched in their memories for years to come. Felix Hartley lay crumpled among the roses, his face peaceful but unmistakably still. Rose petals scattered across his dark coat like confetti at a wedding that had gone terribly wrong. Chapter 2. The Cold Room Door That Latched Itself. The silence that followed the discovery of Felix Hartley's body seemed to stretch interminably, broken only by the steady hum of the cold room's motor and the distant sound of Saturday morning traffic on Much Benham High Street. It was Ursula Hartley who broke the spell, her perfectly modulated voice rising to a pitch that threatened hysteria. "Felix!" She pushed past Stan and would have rushed into the cold room had not Miss Marple's surprisingly firm hand caught her arm. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, but with unmistakable authority, "I think it would be wiser to wait." For the doctor, Dr. Haddock arrived with commendable promptness, his familiar black bag in hand, and his weathered face grave with concern. He was a man in his 60s who had seen enough of death to approach it with respectful efficiency rather than dramatic flourish. After a brief examination conducted in the cramped confines of the cold room, he emerged with the preliminary verdict that most had expected. "Heart attack, most likely," he announced, removing his spectacles to clean them with characteristic deliberation. "Poor chap probably felt unwell, became disoriented in that airless space. These things happen more often than one might think." Inspector Slack arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by Stan, who had bicycled to the police station with admirable presence of mind. Slack was a man who possessed all the official authority his position required and most of the intelligence, though he sometimes failed to apply the latter with the same consistency as the former. His relationship with Miss Marple had evolved over the years from barely concealed irritation to grudging respect, though he would never admit as much publicly. "Right then," Slack announced, surveying the scene with professional thoroughness. "Let's have a proper look at this business." The cold room itself was perhaps 8 feet square, lined with shelves that held the flower buckets in orderly rows. The door, when examined closely, revealed the mechanism that had puzzled Stan. On the inside, a simple thumb latch provided easy egress for anyone who might accidentally find themselves trapped within. On the outside, however, only a smooth metal handle offered any means of opening the door once it had been secured from within. "Interesting," murmured Inspector Slack, running his fingers along the door frame. "To latch this from the outside, you'd need uncommonly long fingers or some sort of tool. Can't see how it could happen by accident." Miss Marple, who had been observing these proceedings with the quiet attention she brought to all matters of human behavior, bent slightly to examine something on the cold room floor. Lying among the scattered rose petals was a florist's card, ivory-colored, and bearing an inscription in careful copperplate script, "To U.H. with love." What caught Miss Marple's experienced eye, however, was not the sentiment, but the condition of the card. It had been bent sharply through the middle, creating a pronounced crease that seemed oddly deliberate. Moreover, the card appeared to have been handled roughly, its edges slightly frayed as though it had been pressed against something unyielding. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you might find this of interest." Slack examined the bent card, with the air of a man determined to overlook nothing, however insignificant it might appear. "Looks like someone's love note," he observed. "Probably fell out of his pocket when he collapsed." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, though her tone suggested she found this explanation less than wholly satisfactory. "Though I notice it's been rather severely creased, almost as though someone had folded it around something thin and rigid." Ivy Pritchard, who had been standing near the counter in a state of barely controlled distress, looked up at the mention of the card. "That's one of ours," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious shock. "We use them for special arrangements. The UH would be for Mrs. Hartley, naturally." Ursula Hartley, who had composed herself with the iron self-control that her upbringing had instilled, examined the card briefly. "I commissioned no such arrangement," she stated firmly. "Certainly nothing requiring a card of this nature." Dr. Haddock, who had been making his final notes, looked up with a slight frown. "There's something else you should know, Inspector. The floor near the body shows signs of having been wet recently. Water, by the smell of it, though it's been mopped up fairly thoroughly. Indeed, one of the flower buckets had been overturned, its contents of roses scattered across the small space. The floor around it bore the telltale streaks that suggested hasty cleaning, though the perpetrator had done a reasonably thorough job of it. "Ivy," Lady Bantry said suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmur of investigation, "you mentioned that Felix came in to select roses for Ursula. How long was he in the cold room?" Ivy pressed her hand to her forehead, clearly struggling to reconstruct the morning's events. "I'm not entirely certain. You see, we were frightfully busy with the preparations for tonight's ball. I was serving several customers at once, and Nell was working on the altar arrangements for tomorrow's service. Felix said he wanted to choose his own dozen, something about ensuring they met Ursula's exacting standards." "And you didn't check on him?" Slack inquired, his tone carefully neutral. "I assumed he would call out when he'd made his selection," Ivy replied, wringing her hands. "He's always been quite particular about his flowers. It wasn't unusual for him to spend considerable time examining the available blooms." Stan, who had been listening to this exchange with growing unease, suddenly spoke up. "That's just it, though. I remember now. When I went to load the van earlier, I could hear the cold room motor working harder than usual. Made a right racket, it did." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Working harder, you say? In what way?" "Well, you see, miss, the motor has to work to keep the temperature steady, but this morning it seemed to be running almost constantly, as though the thermostat had been adjusted." Inspector Slack made a note of this observation, though his expression suggested he was not entirely certain of its significance. Miss Marple, however, filed the information away with a particular care she reserved for details that seemed to illuminate the darker corners of human nature. The examination of Felix Hartley's person revealed little beyond what Dr. Haddock had already determined. His wallet remained untouched, containing a substantial sum in notes along with various business cards and personal papers. His watch, a rather expensive gold piece, still ticked steadily on his wrist. There were no obvious signs of violence, no indication that he had struggled or fought with an assailant. Yet something nagged at Miss Marple's consciousness, some small detail that refused to align itself properly with the apparent facts of the case. She found herself studying the cold room door once more, noting the smooth efficiency of its operation, the precision with which the latch engaged, the particular quality of the seal that kept the precious flowers in their optimal environment. "Tell me, Mrs. Pritchard," she said suddenly, "this safety latch, it's quite foolproof, isn't it? I mean to say, one couldn't accidentally engage it from the outside." Ivy shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not, Miss Marple. The mechanism was specifically designed to prevent such accidents. The latch can only be engaged from within, and there's no way to manipulate it from outside the door. Unless," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully, "one possessed unusual dexterity, or perhaps employed some sort of tool." Inspector Slack, who had been examining the door mechanism with increasing puzzlement, straightened up with evident frustration. "The thing is, if someone did latch this door from the outside, they'd have to have been uncommonly clever about it. Can't see any obvious way it could be done." As the morning progressed and the preliminary investigation continued, the mystery of Felix Hartley's death seemed to deepen rather than resolve. The man had entered the cold room alive and in apparent good health. He had been discovered dead sometime later, with the door securely latched from the inside in a manner that should have been impossible to achieve from without. Dr. Haddock's professional opinion remained unchanged. Felix had most likely suffered a heart attack brought on by the stress of finding himself trapped in the airless space. Yet the question of how he had become trapped in the first place continued to perplex everyone present. Everyone, that is, except Miss Marple, who had begun to perceive in the morning's tragedy the familiar pattern of human malice disguised as natural misfortune. The bent card, the overturned bucket, the unusually hard-working motor, each detail, added another piece to a puzzle that was beginning to assume a distinctly sinister shape. As the authorities completed their preliminary examination and arrangements were made for the removal of Felix Hartley's body, Miss Marple remained in the flower shop, her keen eyes continuing to catalog the small inconsistencies that others had overlooked. She had learned long ago that murder, when it masqueraded as accident, often revealed itself through just such trifling details: the bent card that suggested concealed purpose, the wet floor that spoke of hasty concealment, the door that had latched itself in defiance of its own design. The game, as her fictional contemporary might have said, was afoot. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices bronze on the petal edge. The by. Removal of Felix Hartley's mortal remains had been conducted with the quiet efficiency that marked such solemn occasions in Much Benham. Dr. Haddock supervised the proceedings with his customary professional dignity, while Inspector Slack ensured that every procedural requirement was meticulously observed. The cold room, now empty of its tragic burden, seemed somehow larger yet more oppressive, its glass walls reflecting the subdued lighting with an almost accusatory gleam. Lady Bantry, who had remained throughout the morning's proceedings with a steadfast loyalty that characterized her friendship with Miss Marple, now stood beside the open cold room door, her usually cheerful countenance marked by uncharacteristic gravity. She had witnessed enough of Miss Marple's investigations to recognize the signs when her dear friend's analytical mind had engaged with a puzzle of human behavior. "Jane," she murmured, careful to keep her voice low enough that the others would not overhear. "You've noticed something, haven't you? That expression of yours. I've seen it before." Miss Marple, who had been studying the scattered roses with the absorbed attention of a botanist examining rare specimens, looked up with a slight smile. "My dear Dolly, I fear I may be allowing my imagination to run away with me. Though there is something rather peculiar about these flowers." She moved deeper into the cold room, her steps careful and deliberate on the still damp floor. The roses that had been disturbed during the morning's tragic discovery lay in artistic disarray, their petals creating a carpet of crimson and pink against the utilitarian gray flooring. It was among these fallen blooms that Miss Marple's experienced eye had detected something that struck her as distinctly out of place. Bending with the careful grace of one who had learned to accommodate the limitations of advancing years, Miss Marple lifted one of the scattered roses and examined it closely. The bloom itself was magnificent, a deep red specimen that would have graced any formal arrangement with distinction. Yet, as her fingers traced the outer edges of the petals, she detected an anomaly that sent a small chill of recognition through her experienced mind. "How very curious," she murmured, turning the rose to catch the light more effectively. The serrated edges of several petals showed a distinct bronzing, not the natural browning that might indicate age or poor handling, but something altogether more specific. The discoloration was subtle, affecting only the very tips of the petal, edges yet unmistakable to one who had spent decades tending her own garden with meticulous care. "Dolly," Miss Marple called softly, "you might find this rather interesting." Lady Bantry approached with the cautious steps of one who had learned to expect the unexpected when Miss Marple's attention focused on seemingly insignificant details. She examined the rose that Miss Marple extended toward her, though her untrained eye initially failed to detect what had captured her friend's interest. "It appears perfectly lovely to me," Lady Bantry observed, "though I confess I'm no expert in such matters." "Look here," Miss Marple said, gently, indicating the petal edges with one thin finger. "Do you see how the very tips have taken on that peculiar bronze coloring? It reminds me quite forcibly of what happened to my gooseberry bushes last summer when I made rather a hash of the sulfur treatment. The comparison was apt, though its full significance was not immediately apparent to Lady Bantry. Miss Marple's gardening mishaps were legendary among her circle of friends, though they invariably provided her with useful knowledge for future reference. The sulfur treatment she mentioned had been intended to combat a persistent fungal problem, but an error in measurement had resulted in leaf scorch that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the discoloration she now observed on the rose petals. "You think these flowers have been exposed to sulfur?" Lady Bantry asked, her voice betraying growing interest in the implications. "It would certainly explain the bronzing," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "though one wonders how such exposure might have occurred in a controlled environment like this cold room." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sharp voice of Ursula Hartley, who had approached the cold room entrance with the determined stride of one accustomed to having her observations treated as definitive pronouncements. "I do hope—" "You're not suggesting there's anything amiss with Mrs. Pritchard's flowers," Ursula declared, her tone carrying more than a hint of challenge. "Everyone knows that cold storage can cause petals to dry somewhat. It's perfectly natural for the edges to show signs of dehydration." Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Hartley with a patient courtesy she reserved for those whose certainty exceeded their knowledge. "Indeed, my dear, you're quite right about the effects of cold storage, though in my experience dehydration tends to produce a rather different sort of discoloration. This bronzing suggests something altogether more specific." Ivy Pritchard, who had overheard this exchange while attempting to restore some semblance of order to her disrupted shop, looked up with evident distress. Her professional pride had already suffered considerably from the morning's events, and the suggestion that her flowers might be somehow defective added insult to considerable injury. "I can assure you, Miss Marple," she said with quiet dignity, "that my roses never scorch. The cold room maintains perfect conditions: temperature, humidity, air circulation. There's simply no possibility of the kind of damage you're describing." The conviction in Ivy's voice was unmistakable. Yet Miss Marple detected beneath it a note of uncertainty that suggested the florist was as puzzled by the bronzing as everyone else. Miss Marple had observed enough human nature to recognize the difference between defensive bluster and genuine bewilderment, and Ivy's response clearly fell into the latter category. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied soothingly. "I'm certain your professional standards are impeccable, which makes this little mystery all the more intriguing." She continued her examination of the scattered roses, finding additional specimens that displayed the same telltale bronzing along their petal edges. The discoloration was not universal. Many of the flowers showed no such effects, but it was sufficiently widespread to suggest a common cause rather than random damage. Inspector Slack, who had been conferring with Dr. Haddock near the shop's entrance, approached the cold room with the air of a man determined to wrap up the morning's investigation with proper efficiency. His experience with Miss Marple's observations had taught him to listen respectfully, even when her concern seemed to focus on matters of purely horticultural interest. "Found something significant, Miss Marple?" he inquired, his tone carefully neutral. "Possibly, Inspector," she replied, indicating the bronze petals with characteristic understatement. "Though I suspect others might consider it merely a matter of botanical curiosity." Slack examined the roses she indicated, though his expression suggested that floral abnormalities fell somewhat outside his area of professional expertise. "Can't say I noticed anything particularly unusual," he admitted. "Though I suppose you've got more experience with flowers than most." Dr. Haddock, drawn by the discussion, proved more perceptive in his observations. His medical training had included enough botany to recognize chemical damage when he encountered it, and the bronzing Miss Marple had discovered sparked immediate interest. Curious, he murmured, taking one of the affected roses for closer examination. This type of edge burn suggests exposure to something rather more aggressive than simple dehydration. Sulfur compounds, perhaps, or some other caustic agent. Ursula Hartley's response to this professional opinion was immediate and emphatic. "That's absolutely impossible," she declared. "I specifically requested that these roses be kept in perfect condition. The very suggestion that they might have been contaminated is preposterous." Nell Pritchard, who had been quietly organizing the ribbon supplies near the counter, looked up with obvious concern. "Aunt Ivy," she said hesitantly, "you don't suppose something might have gotten into the cold room's air circulation system? Some sort of chemical that could cause this kind of damage?" The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, creating an atmosphere of uncomfortable speculation. The cold room's ventilation system was necessarily sophisticated, designed to maintain optimal conditions for delicate flowers. Yet the very complexity that made it so effective also created possibilities for contamination that none of them had previously considered. Miss Marple continued her methodical examination of the scattered blooms, cataloging each instance of bronzing, with the careful attention to detail that had served her so well in previous investigations. The pattern that emerged was neither random nor comprehensive. Certain roses showed clear signs of exposure, while others remained pristine, suggesting a localized source rather than systematic contamination. As she worked, Miss Marple found herself thinking of her own garden and the various mishaps that had befallen it over the years. The sulfur incident she had mentioned to Lady Bantry had been instructive in more ways than one, teaching her not only about the proper application of fungicides, but also about the unmistakable signs of chemical burn in plant tissue. The roses before her bore all the hallmarks of such exposure. Yet the mystery of how it had occurred in Ivy Pritchard's meticulously maintained cold room remained as baffling as the larger question of Felix Hartley's untimely death. Miss Marple suspected, however, that the two puzzles might prove to be more closely connected than anyone yet realized. Chapter 4. The Flower Card Written Over. The afternoon light streaming through the shop windows had begun to take on the golden quality that heralded evening's approach, though the events of the morning seemed to have stretched time itself into unnatural configurations. The Founders' Ball, which only hours earlier had dominated everyone's thoughts, now seemed a distant and rather trivial concern in the face of Felix Hartley's unexpected demise. Miss Marple, having completed her examination of the bronze rose petals, turned her attention once more to the bent florist's card that had been discovered near the body. She had requested that Inspector Slack leave it undisturbed for the moment, and he had obliged with the grudging tolerance he reserved for her more peculiar requests. The card itself was of the finest quality, cream-colored, stock with a subtle texture that spoke of expense and good taste. The inscription, "To UH with love," was executed in the elegant copperplate script that marked Ivy Pritchard's hand, each letter formed with the precision of one who had learned penmanship when such skills were considered essential accomplishments. Yet, as Miss Marple held the card up to catch the light more effectively, her keen eyes detected something that had escaped the notice of the others. Beneath the dark ink of the romantic inscription, faint traces of pencil marks were visible, numbers, and letters in a completely different hand, smaller and more utilitarian than the flowing script above. "How very interesting," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles for a clearer view. Lady Bantry, who had maintained her vigilant proximity to Miss Marple's investigations, moved closer with the anticipation of one who had learned to recognize significant discoveries. "What is it, Jane?" "You found something else, haven't you?" "Indeed I have, my dear Dolly. This card appears to have been written over. There's what looks like a stock number or code underneath the romantic sentiment. The implications of this discovery were not immediately apparent to Lady Bantry, but Miss Marple's experience with human nature had taught her that people who wrote over existing marks usually did so for reasons of economy, convenience, or concealment. In a flower shop where presentation was paramount, the reuse of a marked card seemed curiously at odds with professional standards. Ivy Pritchard, summoned by Miss Marple's quiet inquiry, examined the card with growing perplexity. Her face, already strained by the morning's events, took on an expression of genuine bewilderment as she recognized her own handwriting, overlaying what appeared to be shop markings. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We always use fresh cards for customer arrangements. There would be no reason to write over an existing mark." Ursula Hartley, who had been observing these proceedings with barely concealed impatience, stepped forward with the decisive manner of one accustomed to cutting through confusion with authoritative pronouncements. "This is all perfectly ridiculous," she declared, her voice carrying the crystalline edge that marked her moments of supreme irritation. "All I requested was 12 long-stemmed red roses. Surely that requires no elaborate documentation or mysterious coded messages." Miss Marple regarded Mrs. Hartley with a patient attention she gave to all witnesses, regardless of their apparent relevance to the matter at hand. "Of course, my dear. Though I wonder, did you specify any particular requirements for the arrangement? A special vase, perhaps, or particular instructions for delivery?" "Nothing beyond the roses themselves," Ursula replied curtly. "Felix was to select them personally to ensure they met my standards. I hardly think that necessitated extensive correspondence." Nell Pritchard, who had been listening to this exchange while mechanically sorting through ribbon supplies, looked up with sudden interest. "Aunt Ivy always keeps the cards in the special tin. They're counted each week as part of the inventory. If one had stock markings on it, it would have come from somewhere else entirely." This innocent observation created a small stir of interest among the assembled company. Ivy nodded slowly, her professional pride asserting itself despite her obvious distress. "Nell is quite right," she confirmed. "The cards are ordered specially, blank and unmarked. Our stock codes are written on separate labels that attach to the bucket handles. There would be no reason for a code to appear on a customer card." Inspector Slack, who had been making notes with methodical thoroughness, looked up from his notebook with renewed attention. "So this card didn't come from your normal supply. Someone brought it from elsewhere." "Or," Miss Marple interjected gently, "someone took it from elsewhere within the shop and repurposed it for a different use entirely." The distinction was subtle but significant. If the card had been brought from outside, it suggested premeditation and planning. If it had been taken from within the shop's existing supplies, it implied a more spontaneous decision, or perhaps an attempt to create evidence where none had previously existed. Dr. Haddock, who had remained in the shop to complete his preliminary paperwork, approached the small group with the measured tread of one whose professional duties required attention to seemingly minor details. "May I examine this card?" he inquired. Sometimes medical training provides useful perspective on questions of handwriting and documentation. Miss Marple handed over the card with careful reverence, as though it were a piece of ancient parchment requiring delicate handling. Dr. Haddock studied it with the same methodical attention he brought to patient diagnosis, holding it at various angles to catch the light most effectively. "Fascinating," he murmured after several minutes of examination. "The pencil markings are definitely older than the ink inscription. You can see where the pen has slightly disturbed the graphite in places. Moreover, the pressure pattern suggests the card was written on while lying flat, not held in the hand as one might expect for a romantic note." This technical analysis provided additional confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions, though it raised as many questions as it answered. Why would someone take the trouble to write a love note on a card that already bore shop markings? And what significance might those underlying codes have for understanding the morning's tragic events? Ivy Pritchard's examination of the penciled markings revealed them to be consistent with the shop's inventory system, a combination of letters and numbers that indicated flower type, quality, grade, and supplier information. Such codes were routinely written on temporary labels, but never on customer materials. This particular code, Ivy said slowly, her finger tracing the faint markings, refers to premium roses from our wholesale supplier. It would normally be written on a disposal tag, something we use internally and then discard. The revelation added another layer to the mystery. If the card had originally been marked as a disposal tag, its transformation into a romantic message suggested either remarkable carelessness or deliberate misdirection. Miss Marple suspected the latter, given the careful way the original markings had been obscured rather than obliterated. Stan Baxter, who had been listening to these revelations with growing confusion, ventured a hesitant observation. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but if someone wanted to write a proper note, wouldn't they just take a fresh card? There are dozens of them in the tin." It was, Miss Marple reflected, exactly the sort of practical question that went to the heart of human motivation. The answer, she suspected, lay not in convenience or carelessness, but in the peculiar psychology of deception, the way guilty minds often created unnecessary complexity in their attempts to appear innocent. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the shop floor, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the growing collection of anomalies that surrounded Felix Hartley's death. Thick fatigue, bronzed rose petals, the mysteriously latched door, the overwritten card, each detail seemed insignificant in isolation. Yet together they suggested a pattern of deliberate manipulation that transformed apparent accident into something far more sinister. Chapter 5. The Bucket That Smelled of Matches. The investigation had reached that peculiar stage familiar to those who had witnessed Miss Marple's methods before, a point where seemingly unrelated observations began to coalesce into something approaching a coherent pattern. Yet for all her growing certainty that Felix Hartley's death harbored darker secrets than a simple heart attack, Miss Marple knew that suspicion without evidence remained merely educated speculation. It was Stan Baxter who inadvertently provided the next piece of the puzzle. Having been dispatched by Inspector Slack to examine the rear areas of the shop for any signs of disturbance, he had ventured into the small scullery that joined the alley entrance. This utilitarian space served as Ivy's secondary workspace, where the messier aspects of flower preparation could be conducted away from customer view. "There's something rather queer back here," Stan called from the doorway, his voice carrying an odd note of uncertainty. The assembled company, Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, Inspector Slack, and the Pritchard women, followed Stan into the cramped scullery. The space was exactly what one might expect of a working flower shop's auxiliary area. Shelves lined with vases, buckets, and supplies. A deep sink stained with the mineral deposits of countless flower arrangements. And the general accumulation of professional detritus that marked any serious craftsman's workspace. What had caught Stan's attention, however, was a metal saucer, sitting upon one of the lower shelves. The dish itself was unremarkable, the sort of shallow pan one might use to catch water drips or hold small tools. Yet its contents struck him as distinctly out of place in a flower shop's normal operations. "Miss White." Marple approached the saucer with her characteristic deliberation. bending to examine its contents without disturbing them. The bottom of the dish was dusted with a yellowish granular substance that immediately brought to mind her extensive experience with garden chemicals. The smell that rose from the residue was faint but unmistakable. The sharp, acrid odor of burnt sulfur. "How very illuminating," she murmured, straightening with the careful movements of one who had learned to husband her energy for important moments. Lady Bantry, who had developed an almost supernatural ability to interpret her friend's expressions, moved closer with evident interest. "It's connected to the bronze petals, isn't it, Jane? This yellowish powder, it's sulfur." "Indeed it appears to be, my dear Dolly, though one wonders what purpose it might have served in its current location." Inspector Slack, summoned by this exchange, examined the saucer with professional thoroughness. His experience with criminal investigation had taught him to recognize the significance of chemical residues, though the specific implications of sulfur in a flower shop context required expert interpretation. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, turning to Ivy with careful neutrality, "would you normally use sulfur in your shop operations?" Ivy approached, the saucer with obvious bewilderment, her professional knowledge warring with the evidence before her eyes. "Certainly not in this form," she replied slowly. "We occasionally use sulfur-based fungicides in the greenhouse, but those come as liquid preparations. This granular residue suggests something altogether different." Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to the rubbish sack that stood beside the scullery door, awaiting collection by the municipal authorities. Something metallic glinted among the ordinary detritus of shop operations, catching the afternoon light that filtered through the small window. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you might find the contents of that refuse bag rather interesting." Slack's investigation of the rubbish revealed several items of potential significance, chief among them an empty tin that had once contained sulfur candles. The label, though partially obscured by grime and age, clearly identified the contents as greenhouse fumigation supplies, the sort of thing any serious horticulturist might possess for pest control purposes. Dr. Haddock, who had been completing his paperwork in the main shop, was summoned to examine these new discoveries. His medical training included sufficient knowledge of toxicology to recognize the potential significance of sulfur compounds in an enclosed space. "Fascinating," he observed, examining both the empty tin and the residue in the metal saucer. "Sulfur candles are designed to fumigate greenhouse spaces by releasing sulfur dioxide gas. In a confined area, the concentration could become quite dangerous, particularly for someone with respiratory sensitivities." The implications of this observation sent a collective chill through the assembled company. Felix Hartley's medical history was well known in Much Benham. He had suffered from periodic chest complaints since his service in the war, and Dr. Haddock had frequently cautioned him about exposure to airborne irritants. "You're suggesting," Inspector Slack said slowly, "that someone deliberately exposed Mr. Hartley to sulfur dioxide, that this wasn't a natural heart attack?" Dr. Haddock chose his words with the careful precision of one whose professional opinions carried legal weight. "I'm suggesting that exposure to concentrated sulfur dioxide could certainly precipitate a cardiac episode in a susceptible individual. Whether such exposure was accidental or deliberate would be a matter for investigation rather than medical speculation." Stan Baxter, who had been listening to this technical discussion with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up. "That's where this match smell was coming from, then. I noticed it earlier but didn't think much of it. Just assumed someone had been lighting the shop's heating system." This casual observation provided another piece of the emerging puzzle. Sulfur candles required ignition, and the faint odor of spent matches that Stan had detected suggested recent combustion within the scullery area. Ivy Pritchard's reaction to these discoveries was immediate and emphatic. I can assure you all that I have never used sulfur candles in my shop, she declared, her voice rising slightly with the stress of the moment. The ventilation system in the cold room is far too sophisticated to require such crude fumigation methods. Nell Pritchard, who had been observing her aunt's distress with evident concern, ventured a hesitant explanation. Perhaps the tin came from the old greenhouse. Supplies, Aunt Ivy. You know how Stan sometimes clears out the storage shed for disposal? Stan nodded eagerly, grateful for any explanation that might reduce the growing tension in the room. That's right, Mrs. Pritchard. Just this week, you asked me to sort through the old chemical supplies and dispose of anything past its useful date. Most of it went straight into the rubbish collection. This explanation possessed the virtue of plausibility. Yet Miss Marple detected certain inconsistencies that troubled her orderly mind. If the sulfur candle tin had been disposed of as part of routine cleaning, why had its contents apparently been used so recently? And why would the residue appear in the scullery rather than remaining safely contained in the storage shed? The scullery itself bore additional traces of recent activity that seemed inconsistent with normal shop operations. The sink showed signs of hasty washing with mineral stains that suggested the rapid cleaning of metal objects. More significantly, the floor near the saucer showed the telltale dampness that indicated recent mopping, unnecessary maintenance for an area that typically accumulated only dry debris. As Miss Marple catalogued these observations, she found herself constructing a narrative that linked the sulfur residue to the bronzed rose petals, the mysterious door latch, and the overwritten florist card. Each element seemed to support the others in a pattern of deliberate deception designed to transform murder into apparent natural death. The afternoon was advancing toward evening, and the approaching Founders' Ball cast an increasingly surreal shadow over the day's events. Yet Miss Marple suspected that the evening's revelations would prove far more significant than any social gathering, however well-intentioned its organizers might be. Chapter 6. Green Tape on the Alley Cobbles. The discovery of the sulfur residue had cast a decidedly ominous shadow over what had begun as a routine investigation into an apparent heart attack. Inspector Slack, whose experience with criminal matters had taught him to recognize the moment when coincidence crossed the threshold into deliberate design, now approached the case with a heightened attention that marked serious police work. It was during his methodical examination of the shop's exterior that he made the next significant discovery. The alley that ran behind Pritchard and Posey was typical of such commercial spaces. Narrow, functional, and paved with the irregular cobblestones that had served Much Benham's merchants for the better part of 2 centuries. Yet among these time-worn stones, something distinctly modern caught his practiced eye. "Miss Marple," he called, from the alley entrance, his voice carrying the particular note of satisfaction that accompanied the discovery of tangible evidence. "You might want to have a look at this." The small company emerged from the scullery to find Inspector Slack, crouched beside the point where the alley met the high street. Adhering to one of the cobblestones was a short length of green tape, the specialized florist tape that professionals used for securing stems and creating arrangements. The tape appeared fresh, its adhesive surface still tacky enough to have collected a light coating of street dust. Miss Marple examined the find with characteristic thoroughness, noting both its placement and condition. The tape had been torn rather than cut, suggesting hasty removal, and its position near the street indicated it had been discarded or lost during rapid movement. "How very suggestive," she murmured, rising from her examination with the deliberate grace that had become her trademark. One wonders how such professional material came to be abandoned in so public a location. Stan Baxter, summoned to account for his use of florist tape during the morning's activities, protested his innocence with the earnest conviction of youth. "I haven't used any tape today, Inspector," he declared, producing his handlebar roll for examination. "See, it's completely intact, just as it was when I arrived this morning." The roll of tape attached to Stan's bicycle was indeed undisturbed, its green surface unmarked by any indication of recent use. This observation eliminated the most obvious explanation for the alley discovery and suggested that the tape had originated from within the shop itself. Nell Pritchard, questioned about her morning's work, provided equally convincing evidence of careful tape management. "I used tape only at the counter this morning," she explained, indicating several arrangements that bore the neat, professional binding characteristic of her skilled work. "Each piece was measured and cut precisely. I never tear tape when creating arrangements for customers." This systematic elimination of innocent explanations left Miss Marple with the increasingly certain conviction that the discarded tape represented evidence of activity that its user had preferred to conceal. The location of the discovery at the junction between the private alley and the public street suggested movement between the shop's rear areas and the broader world beyond. Lady Bantry, who had developed an almost telepathic understanding of her friend's investigative methods, posed the question that Miss Marple's expression clearly invited. "You think this tape was used for something connected to Felix's death, don't you, Jane?" "I think, my dear Dolly, that professional florist tape serves remarkably specific purposes. It's designed to be strong, flexible, and capable of maintaining secure connections under stress. One might say it possesses exactly the qualities one would require for, shall we say, mechanical applications beyond simple flower arrangement." The oblique nature of this observation was characteristic of Miss Marple's investigative style, yet its implications were not lost on Inspector Slack. His examination of the cold room door had already established that external manipulation of the internal latch would require some form of tool or implement. The green tape, with its combination of strength and flexibility, suggested a possible method for such manipulation. "You're thinking someone used this tape as part of a mechanism for operating the door latch from outside," Slack observed, his tone indicating growing professional interest in the possibility. Miss Marple's response carried the careful neutrality she employed when encouraging others to reach their own conclusions. "I think, Inspector, that the tape's placement near the street suggests it was discarded by someone leaving the scene rather rapidly. Whether its previous use involved mechanical applications would be a matter for careful investigation." This diplomatic phrasing concealed Miss Marple's growing certainty that the green tape represented a crucial element in the method by which Felix Hartley had been trapped within the cold room. Her experience with human ingenuity, particularly when applied to criminal purposes, had taught her that murderers often displayed remarkable creativity in adapting everyday materials to sinister ends. Dr. Haddock, whose medical training included sufficient mechanical knowledge to appreciate the practical aspects of the discussion, examined the discarded tape with professional interest. "The adhesive quality is quite remarkable," he observed. "Strong, enough to maintain secure attachment even under considerable stress, yet flexible enough to conform to irregular surfaces." The technical assessment provided additional support for Miss Marple's emerging theory, though she refrained from articulating the full implications of her suspicions. The pattern of evidence was becoming increasingly clear. The sulfur candle, the bronze petals, the overwritten card, and now the discarded tape, all pointed toward a carefully planned deception designed to transform murder into apparent accident. Inspector Slack's examination of the cold room door revealed additional evidence that supported this interpretation. The bottom edge of the door, where it met the floor, showed a faint groove in the accumulated dust, a linear mark that suggested the passage of something thin and flexible beneath the sealed barrier. "Interesting," he murmured, tracing the mark with one finger. Something's been passed under this door recently. Something thin enough to fit through the gap, but substantial enough to leave a mark. The groove's position corresponded exactly with the internal latch mechanism, suggesting that external manipulation had indeed occurred. Moreover, the mark's characteristics were consistent with the passage of the green tape, particularly if it had been employed as part of a more complex mechanism. Miss Marple's examination of the groove revealed additional details that supported her developing theory. The mark showed not only the passage of something beneath the door, but also signs of lateral movement, the kind of manipulation one might expect if someone were attempting to operate the internal latch from outside. "Most illuminating," she observed, rising from her examination with evident satisfaction. "The physical evidence appears to support the theoretical possibility quite convincingly." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the alley cobblestones, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the elegant simplicity of the method that was beginning to reveal itself. The green tape, combined with some form of rigid implement, could, indeed, provide the means for external manipulation of the cold room's internal latch. The discarded evidence near the street suggested hasty disposal by someone anxious to eliminate traces of their activity. Yet questions remained about the specific mechanism employed, and more crucially, the identity of the person who had possessed both the technical knowledge and the murderous intent necessary to transform Ivy Pritchard's pristine cold room into a death chamber. Miss Marple suspected that the answers to these questions lay not in further physical evidence, but in the complex web of human relationships that connected the morning's participants in ways that had yet to be fully explored. Chapter 7. The Thermostat Set for November. The accumulation of evidence had reached that critical juncture, where individual anomalies began to form a coherent narrative of deliberate malice. Miss Marple, whose long experience with the darker aspects of human nature had taught her to recognize the patterns by which ordinary people justified extraordinary crimes, felt the familiar stirring of certainty that accompanied the approach of truth. It was her own methodical nature that led her back into the cold room for a more thorough examination of its mechanical systems. The sulfur residue, the bronzed petals, and the discarded tape had painted a picture of sophisticated planning, yet she sensed that additional evidence remained to be discovered among the utilitarian details that others might overlook. The cold room's temperature control mechanism occupied a discreet position near the door, its brass dial and mechanical housing bearing the patina of professional use. Miss Marple's examination of this device revealed an anomaly that struck her as immediately significant. The thermostat had been adjusted to a markedly lower setting than the mild May weather would require. "How curious," she murmured, studying the dial with the absorbed attention she brought to all matters of domestic management. This setting would be more appropriate for November than for spring flower storage. Inspector Slack, summoned by her observation, examined the thermostat with growing interest. His investigation of various criminal enterprises had taught him that mechanical evidence often provided the most reliable testimony, free from the complications of human memory and motivation. "What would be the effect of setting the temperature so low?" he inquired, recognizing that the answer might prove significant to understanding the morning's events. Miss Marple's years of managing household mechanical systems had provided her with practical knowledge that proved unexpectedly relevant to criminal investigation. "The cooling system would run more frequently and more vigorously," she explained. "The fan that circulates air within the chamber would operate almost continuously to maintain such a low temperature during warm weather." The implications of this observation began to crystallize with disturbing clarity. If someone had deliberately lowered the thermostat setting The increased air circulation would have the effect of distributing any airborne contaminants throughout the confined space with remarkable efficiency. The sulfur dioxide from a burning candle would not merely accumulate in one corner, but would be rapidly dispersed throughout the chamber. Lady Bantry, whose friendship with Miss Marple had made her surprisingly knowledgeable about the mechanics of criminal investigation, grasped the significance immediately. "You mean whoever set the temperature was ensuring that the sulfur fumes would circulate quickly through the entire space?" "Indeed, my dear Dolly. It suggests a rather sophisticated understanding of both the ventilation system and the properties of sulfur dioxide gas." Dr. Haddock's medical expertise provided additional confirmation of this theory's validity. Rapid air circulation would certainly accelerate the distribution of any toxic substance, he agreed. The effect would be to create a uniformly contaminated environment rather than allowing for areas of relative safety. Ivy Pritchard's reaction to the discovery of the altered thermostat setting was immediate and emphatic. "I never adjust the temperature so drastically," she protested, her professional pride evident in every word. "Such a setting would be wasteful of electricity and potentially harmful to delicate blooms. There would be no reason for such extreme cooling in May." Her protest carried the ring of professional conviction. Yet Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to a detail that suggested recent manipulation of the control mechanism. The brass dial showed faint but unmistakable smear marks, traces of some metallic substance that caught the light when viewed from the proper angle. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you might find these markings rather interesting." Slack's examination of the smear marks revealed them to be consistent with silver polish, the kind of commercial preparation used for maintaining church plate and domestic metalware. The substance had apparently been transferred from someone's fingers or gloves to the thermostat dial during the process of adjustment. This discovery prompted immediate scrutiny of the assembled company's hands and clothing for traces of similar polish. Ursula Hartley's elegant gloves, retrieved from her handbag, showed distinct evidence of recent contact with silver cleaning compounds. "Hardly surprising," she explained, her tone suggesting that such domestic virtue should be above suspicion. "I spent the morning polishing communion vessels. The altar guild takes its responsibilities seriously, particularly before important occasions like tomorrow's special service." The explanation possessed the virtue of verifiable truth. Several parishioners could confirm Ursula's presence at the church earlier that morning. Yet Miss Marple's experience with human nature had taught her that innocent activities often provided convenient cover for less innocent enterprises. Stan Baxter's account of the morning's events provided an additional piece of the mechanical puzzle. "I remember now," he said suddenly. "When I first arrived this morning, the cold room motor was making more noise than usual, humming away like it was working overtime, if you know what I mean." This casual observation provided temporal evidence that the thermostat adjustment had occurred early in the day, before Felix Hartley's fatal visit to the cold room. The timing suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous action. Someone had prepared the chamber's atmosphere in advance of the intended victim's arrival. Miss Marple's reconstruction of the morning's events was beginning to assume a chilling clarity. The sulfur candle had been ignited within the cold room, the thermostat adjusted to ensure rapid distribution of the toxic fumes, and the trap prepared for Felix Hartley's unsuspecting entry. The mechanical precision of the plan spoke to careful observation of the shop's operations and intimate knowledge of its systems. Yet questions remained about the specific sequence of events and the identity of the person who possessed both the technical knowledge and the murderous intent necessary to execute such a plan. Miss Marple suspected that the answers lay not merely in mechanical evidence, but in the complex web of human relationships and motivations that connected the morning's participants. The thermostat setting, with its silver polish smears and inappropriate adjustment, represented more than mere mechanical tampering. It constituted evidence of careful planning, technical sophistication, and access to the cold room's controls during the crucial period when the trap was being prepared. As the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the shop floor, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the elegant ruthlessness of the method that was revealing itself. The killer had transformed Ivy Pritchard's professional equipment into instruments of murder, using the very systems designed to preserve life, and beauty as means of delivering death. The irony was not lost on her. In a shop dedicated to celebrating life's most joyous occasions, someone had orchestrated a tragedy of remarkable subtlety and devastating effectiveness. Inspector Slack's methodical documentation of the evidence was approaching completion. Yet Miss Marple sensed that the most crucial revelations remained ahead. The mechanical evidence told the story of method and means, but the question of motive and identity required a different sort of investigation entirely. Chapter 8. The Florist's Wire with Linen Fluff. The systematic examination of Pritchard and Posey's equipment and supplies had become a matter of professional necessity rather than mere curiosity. Inspector Slack, whose methodical nature demanded thorough documentation of all potential evidence, had turned his attention to the various tools and materials that comprised a working florist's inventory. The drawer containing the shop's collection of florist's wire occupied a position beneath the main counter, its contents organized with the precision that characterized Ivy Pritchard's professional standards. Coils of wire in various gauges lay in neat compartments, each designated for specific applications in the complex art of flower arrangement. It was Miss Marple who first noticed the anomaly among these carefully maintained supplies. One length of 18-gauge wire, the heavy-duty material used for supporting substantial arrangements, showed signs of recent use that distinguished it from its pristine companions. The wire had been bent into a sharp dogleg configuration, creating an angular hook that spoke of purposeful manipulation rather than casual handling. "Inspector," she said quietly, lifting the bent wire from its compartment with careful reverence. "This appears to have been fashioned for a very specific purpose." Slack's examination of the wire revealed additional evidence of recent use. Caught on the sharp end of the improvised hook was a small wisp of fabric, white linen thread that gleamed against the dark metal like a tiny flag of surrender. "Linen," Miss Marple observed, holding the thread up to catch the afternoon light, "and recently acquired, by the look of it." The discovery prompted immediate examination of the clothing worn by those present in the shop. Nell Pritchard's work smock, constructed of practical oilcloth, could not have been the source of the linen fiber. Stan Baxter's sturdy cotton garments similarly failed to match the delicate thread found on the wire. Ivy Pritchard's attire, however, proved more promising. Her working apron, crafted from the fine linen that had once been standard in well-managed households, showed signs of wear that had rendered its hem particularly vulnerable to snagging. Miss Marple's gentle examination revealed a small pulled thread that matched exactly the fiber found on the bent wire. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, comparing the two samples with the methodical attention she brought to all matters of domestic detail. "The match appears to be quite precise." Ivy's reaction to this discovery combined bewilderment with growing distress. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would my apron thread be on a piece of florist's wire? I never use the heavy-gauge wire for ordinary arrangements." The question hung in the air like incense, creating an atmosphere of uncomfortable speculation. Miss Marple's experience with human nature had taught her that innocent explanations often existed for the most suspicious circumstances. Yet the combination of evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Lady Bantry, whose friendship with Miss Marple had made her remarkably astute about the direction of investigations, posed the question that everyone was beginning to contemplate. "Jane, you don't suppose this wire was used as part of the mechanism for operating the door latch from outside?" Miss Marple's response carried the careful precision she employed when encouraging others to reach their own conclusions. It would certainly possess the necessary qualities, sufficient rigidity to transmit pressure, while remaining flexible, enough to negotiate the space beneath the door. Inspector Slack's practical mind immediately grasped the mechanical implications. "You're suggesting someone threaded this wire under the cold room door and used it to press down the internal latch?" "I am suggesting, Inspector, that such a method would be theoretically possible for someone with sufficient ingenuity and determination. The bent wire, with its purposeful configuration and telltale linen fiber, provided crucial evidence for the method by which Felix Hartley had been trapped within the cold room. Yet Miss Marple recognized that demonstrating theoretical possibility remained insufficient without practical verification. "Perhaps," she said, with characteristic diffidence, "we might test the feasibility of such a mechanism." What followed was a demonstration that would have seemed absurd under different circumstances, but now carried the weight of life and death. Using Lady Bantry as an assistant, Miss Marple carefully threaded the bent wire beneath the cold room door, manipulating it with the patience of one accustomed to delicate domestic tasks. The wire's sharp hook, when properly positioned, could indeed engage the internal latch mechanism. With careful pressure applied through the wire, the latch could be pressed downward, securing the door from within while the operator remained safely outside. "Remarkable," Dr. Haddock observed, watching the demonstration with professional interest. "The method is both simple and effective, requiring no specialized tools beyond materials readily available in any flower shop." The practical verification of the murder method answered crucial questions about means and opportunity, yet it raised equally significant questions about knowledge and access. The technique required intimate familiarity with the cold room's latch, mechanism, and considerable skill in wire manipulation. Miss Marple's examination of the bent card, discovered earlier in the investigation, now assumed new significance. The sharp crease through its center corresponded exactly with the wire's configuration, suggesting that the card had been folded around the wire to create a more manageable tool. "Most ingenious," she observed, demonstrating how the card could serve as a guide for threading the wire beneath the door. The cardboard would prevent the wire from catching on irregularities in the floor while providing better control over its movement. The linen thread caught on the wire's end told its own story of the method's execution. As the wire was withdrawn after securing the latch, it had snagged briefly on Ivy's apron, leaving behind the incriminating evidence that now linked her directly to the murder weapon. Inspector Slack's documentation of this evidence was thorough and methodical, yet Miss Marple sensed that crucial questions remained about motive and opportunity. The mechanical evidence provided compelling proof of method, but the human elements of the crime required different sorts of investigation. Ivy Pritchard's growing distress was evident to all present, though whether it stemmed from grief, guilt, or simple bewilderment remained unclear. Her professional reputation, built over years of dedicated service to much Benham's social occasions, now hung in the balance of an investigation that seemed to point inexorably toward her involvement in Felix Hartley's death. As the shadows of late afternoon began to gather in the corners of the shop, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the elegant simplicity of the murder method that had been revealed. The bent wire, the folded card, the green tape, and the adjusted thermostat combined to create a weapon of remarkable sophistication, one that transformed the tools of beauty and celebration into instruments of death. Yet she sensed that the complete truth remained partially concealed, waiting for the final pieces of evidence that would illuminate not merely the method of murder, but the human passions that had made such desperate measures seem necessary. Chapter 9. The Rose That Drank a Copper Penny. The demonstration of the wire mechanism had provided compelling evidence of method. Yet Miss Marple's experienced mind continued to catalog the smaller details that often proved most revealing of human character and motivation. It was these domestic particulars, she had learned, that frequently distinguished between theoretical possibility and actual guilt. Lady Bantry, whose long association with Miss Marple's investigations had sharpened her observational skills considerably, found herself drawn back to the cold room's interior. The scattered roses and overturned buckets that had marked the scene of Felix Hartley's death still awaited proper restoration, though their evidential value had been thoroughly documented. "Jane," she said suddenly, her voice carrying that note of discovery that Miss Marple had learned to recognize, "there's something rather odd about one of these flower buckets." Miss Marple approached with characteristic deliberation, her attention focusing on the galvanized container that Lady Bantry indicated. At first glance, it appeared identical to its companions, a utilitarian vessel designed for the practical business of keeping cut flowers fresh. Yet closer examination revealed a detail that struck both ladies as distinctly out of place in a modern flower shop. Resting at the bottom of the bucket, clearly visible through the remaining water, was a single copper penny. The coin's distinctive color marked it as one of the older specimens that had circulated before the war, genuine copper rather than the bronze alloy that had replaced it in more recent years. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, lifting the penny from its aquatic resting place with careful reverence. One doesn't often encounter such old-fashioned techniques in contemporary establishments. The discovery prompted an exchange of glances between the assembled company that spoke volumes about the significance of this seemingly trivial find. Dr. Haddock, whose medical practice had brought him into contact with various folk remedies and traditional practices, was the first to grasp the implications. "A copper penny in the flower water," he observed with evident interest. "That's an old gardener's trick for prolonging the life of cut roses. The copper acts as a natural fungicide, preventing bacterial growth in the water." Miss Marple nodded approvingly at this professional confirmation of her own horticultural knowledge. "Indeed, Doctor, though I believe the practice has largely fallen out of favor with the introduction of modern flower preservatives." Inspector Slack, whose investigation had taught him to recognize the significance of outdated techniques in contemporary crimes, made careful note of the discovery. "Mrs. Pritchard, would this penny method be part of your normal shop procedures?" Ivy Pritchard's response carried the unmistakable ring of professional authority. "We use commercial flower sachets now, Inspector. They're far more reliable than the old household remedies. I haven't used copper pennies in arrangements for years." The assertion possessed the weight of professional expertise. Yet Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to Nell Pritchard's reaction to the discovery. The young woman's face showed genuine puzzlement rather than recognition, suggesting that the penny technique was indeed foreign to the shop's current practices. "Nell, dear," Miss Marple inquired gently, "had you encountered this copper penny method before today?" "Never, Miss Marple," Nell replied with earnest conviction. "Aunt Ivy has always been most particular about using the proper commercial preparations. She says the old ways are unreliable for professional work." This innocent confirmation provided crucial evidence about the penny's provenance. If neither Ivy nor Nell had placed the coin in the bucket as part of their normal procedures, its presence suggested the involvement of someone whose knowledge of flower care dated to an earlier era. Lady Bantry's memory, sharpened by years of social observation, provided the final piece of this particular puzzle. "I remember now," she exclaimed with evident satisfaction. "Ivy, you used to swear by copper pennies when you first opened the shop. Don't you recall? You mentioned it specifically when you arranged the flowers for my silver wedding anniversary." The recollection struck Ivy with visible force, her face registering recognition followed by something approaching dismay. "Yes," she said slowly. "I did use that method in the early days. My mother taught it to me when I was learning the trade. But that was years ago. I stopped when the modern preservatives became available." Miss Marple's gentle probing revealed the full significance of this admission. The copper penny technique was not merely outdated. It was specifically associated with Ivy's personal history and traditional training. Its appearance in the cold room bucket suggested the involvement of someone whose knowledge of flower care was both intimate and historically rooted. "The interesting question," Miss Marple observed with characteristic understatement, "is why someone would revert to such an old-fashioned method on this particular morning." The answer, she suspected, lay not in practical considerations, but in the unconscious habits that emerged under stress. When confronted with the need to arrange flowers around Felix Hartley's body, the killer had fallen back on the traditional methods that represented their deepest training and instinct. Inspector Slack's examination of the bucket revealed additional evidence that supported this interpretation. The water level and flower arrangement suggested hasty work, roses thrust into the container without the careful attention to aesthetics that characterized professional arrangements. "Someone was in a considerable hurry," he observed, noting the careless positioning of the stems. "This doesn't look like the work of a professional florist taking proper care with valuable blooms." The observation provided crucial insight into the killer's state of mind during the crucial moments after Felix's death. Despite careful planning of the murder method, the need to create a convincing tableau around the body had provoked hasty, instinctive actions that revealed more about the perpetrator than any amount of deliberate deception. Miss Marple's synthesis of the evidence was beginning to assume definitive shape. The copper penny, with its connection to traditional methods in Ivy's personal history, provided the kind of unconscious revelation that often proved most damaging to criminal deception. "It's remarkable," she observed to Lady Bantry, "how people revert to their earliest training under pressure. The methods we learn first often resurface when conscious thought gives way to instinct." The comment carried implications that were not lost on those present. If the copper penny technique was specifically associated with Ivy's traditional training, its appearance in the murder scene suggested her direct involvement in staging the crime scene. Yet Miss Marple sensed that additional revelations awaited discovery, details that would illuminate not merely the question of guilt, but the complex motivations that had driven someone to transform a flower shop into a chamber of death. The copper penny was merely one thread in a tapestry of evidence that was approaching its final, devastating pattern. As the late afternoon light continued to fade over much Benham High Street, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the tragic irony that the very traditions of care and preservation that defined Ivy's profession had become the instrument by which her guilt would be established. The copper penny that had once symbolized professional pride now gleamed with the dull accusation of evidence in a capital crime. Chapter 10. Evening Song and the Name. Hidden by the bouquet. The evening shadows had begun their stately procession across much Benham when Miss Marple finally gathered the threads of evidence into their final, inexorable pattern. The Reverend Clement's sitting room, with its familiar atmosphere of quiet contemplation, provided the appropriate setting for revelations that would forever alter the peaceful facade of village life. Those who had witnessed the day's tragic events sat in subdued assembly. Inspector Slack with his methodical notebook, Dr. Haddock with his professional gravity, Lady Bantry with her loyal attention, and the principals from Pritchard and Posey, whose lives had been so dramatically interrupted by death. The absence of Felix Hartley cast a palpable shadow over the gathering, while the approaching founders' ball seemed a mockery of celebration. Miss Marple arranged herself in the comfortable chair that long association had made particularly her own, her knitting bag at her side, and her expression carrying that serene certainty which marked the conclusion of her investigations. The accumulated evidence lay before them like pieces of an intricate puzzle, each element possessing significance that had been painstakingly revealed through the day's systematic inquiry. "I think," she began with characteristic diffidence, "that we have gathered sufficient information to understand how poor Mr. Hartley met his unfortunate end, though I confess the method displays a sophistication that speaks rather poorly of human ingenuity when applied to criminal purposes." Inspector Slack's pencil hovered expectantly over his notebook, ready to record the official conclusion of an investigation that had transformed apparent accident into deliberate murder. The mechanical evidence had been thoroughly documented, yet the human elements of motive and opportunity required Miss Marple's particular insight into the complexities of village relationships. "The method itself was elegantly simple," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the measured cadence of careful explanation. "Someone lit a sulfur candle within the cold room, having first adjusted the thermostat to ensure rapid circulation of the toxic fumes. Mr. Hartley was lured inside, perhaps to select roses for his wife, and the door was then secured from outside, using a florist's wire threaded beneath the threshold." She paused to allow this technical summary to settle in the minds of her audience before proceeding to the more complex questions of identity and motivation. "The physical evidence tells us several important things about our culprit. First, they possessed intimate knowledge of the cold room's ventilation system and latch mechanism. Second, they had access to sulfur candles and the skill to use them effectively. Third, they were familiar with traditional flower preservation, methods that have largely fallen out of professional use." Lady Bantry's expression reflected growing comprehension of the direction Miss Marple's reasoning was taking. The accumulation of technical knowledge and traditional expertise pointed toward someone whose involvement with the flower trade extended beyond casual acquaintance. "Moreover," Miss Marple continued, "our perpetrator made several unconscious errors that revealed more about their identity than any amount of deliberate deception might have concealed. The copper penny in the flower bucket, the reversion to traditional preservation methods under stress, the linen thread caught on the wire, all these details speak to habits and training that run deeper than conscious thought." Ivy Pritchard's face had grown increasingly pale as the inexorable logic of Miss Marple's reconstruction proceeded. Her hands, so skilled in the creation of beauty, now trembled slightly as they rested in her lap. "But perhaps most significantly," Miss Marple said gently, "we must consider the question of motive. What could drive someone to such desperate measures against a man who, for all his faults, was a pillar of community respectability?" The answer, when it came, emerged not from Miss Marple's direct accusation, but from Ivy Pritchard's own breaking spirit. The weight of evidence, combined with the compassionate understanding in Miss Marple's voice, finally overcame the defensive barriers that had sustained her through the day's ordeal. "He was going to destroy everything," Ivy whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "The shop, my reputation, the memory of my late husband. Felix, discovered some irregularities in our wartime supplies, sugar for preserving blooms that came from questionable sources during rationing. He threatened to expose it all unless I agreed to give up my lease. The confession carried the weight of accumulated desperation and fear. Ivy's wartime struggles to maintain her business had led to compromises that seemed minor at the time, but had grown into weapons of blackmail in Felix's calculating hands. I gnawed, only meant to frighten him, she continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. The sulfur candle was meant to make him ill, to give him a taste of what real suffering felt like. I never intended for it to prove fatal. Miss Marple's response carried the gentle firmness that marked her approach to human frailty. But you did know about his chest complaints, my dear. You must have understood the risks involved in exposing him to concentrated sulfur dioxide. The accusation was delivered with such compassionate understanding that it seemed less like condemnation than pastoral counsel. Yet its implications were unmistakable. The murder had been deliberate, calculated, and executed with full knowledge of its likely consequences. Inspector Slack's arrest of Ivy Pritchard proceeded with the formal dignity that such moments required. Her confession had eliminated the need for prolonged legal proceedings, though the tragedy of her circumstances would echo through much Benham for years to come. As the evening deepened toward night, Miss Marple found herself in Lady Bantry's drawing room, mechanically trimming a bruised rose and slipping a copper penny into the water. The gesture seemed both futile and necessary, a small act of preservation in the face of overwhelming destruction. A shop dedicated to celebrating life's most joyous occasions, Lady Bantry observed with a shiver, and such ugliness hidden beneath the surface. Miss Marple's response carried the philosophical acceptance that long experience with human nature had taught her. Roses have thorns, my dear Dolly, and shops have shadows. It is usually the smallest domestic habits, a card reused, a wire, bent just so, a penny dropped from memory, that reveal the truth when larger deceptions fail. The Founders' Ball would proceed as scheduled, though its celebrations would be forever marked by the day's tragic revelations. Much Benham would eventually heal from the scandal. New florists would take over the shop on High Street, and life would resume its familiar patterns. Yet Miss Marple knew that the lessons of the day would linger in the collective memory of the village, a reminder that the capacity for both great beauty and terrible ugliness resided within every human heart, separated only by the circumstances that tested the boundaries of moral endurance. The roses in Lady Bantry's drawing room continued their silent testimony to the persistence of beauty in a world marked by tragedy, while outside, the evening bells of much Benham called the faithful to evensong with their ancient promise of redemption and peace.